Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wassalamu ala rasulillah, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, amma ba'd. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Brothers and sisters in Islam, we have completed the battles of Badr and the battles of Uhud. A lot happened in between Uhud and the next major battle, which was Khandaq, which happened a good 2 years later. The main thing that happened was that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, because of breaches of contract, if you remember in the very beginning we discussed, one of the other discussions we had with regards to the life of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he had formed what is called a treaty with the entire Medina, like a code of conduct and a constitution for the entire Medina and all its the people around Medina, including the Jews. They all signed. And then the Banu Nadir tribe went against the treaty, right? They were assisting the kuffar, they were raiding, etc., etc. So what happened was they were then expelled from Medina, and many of them not only taking their belongings and their possessions, but also their malice and hatred for the Muslims along with them went and settled in Khaybar, which was on the outskirts of Medina at the time, the most plentiful date farms you've ever seen in your life, right? So the Jews were burning because they got kicked out of Medina and they wanted to go back to Medina. So they thought the easiest way to do this is to use money that they had in Khaybar with all the dates. They went to Makkah, they sent a delegation to Makkah, and the Banu Ghatfan tribes and the Quraysh of Makkah were then offered 1 year's date produce from Khaybar if they would form an alliance with the Jews of Medina who were still there, or the Jews of Khaybar rather, and the Jews of Medina. And then attack the Muslims in Medina, expel them or get rid of them or kill them completely, and then the Banu Nadir tribe can come back to Medina. So when Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam learnt of this, because I explained to you before that he was on the ball all the time, he had his finger on the pulse constantly, he had his informants and his spies everywhere to gather intelligence about the whereabouts and the movements of his enemy and what they were up to and what they were doing, and found out about this, he started consulting with the Sahaba. Right, brothers and sisters in Islam, back to the drawing board, because Uhud is done. We've had 2 years to catch our breath. Now we're finding out that the Jews that we kicked out from Banu Nadir have joined up with the Jews in Khaybar, and they are doing X, Y, and Z. They formed an alliance with the Kuffar of Makkah and some of the other tribes, offered them money to attack us. It's about to go down. What do we do? Salman Farsi radiallahu anhu, who was very, very old at the time, by the way. I'm not going to get into a whole discussion, but scholars argue that he was probably in his early 320s. He was in his early 320s when this happened. Regardless of how old he was probably the oldest person there. And he said, look, I'm from Persia. Where I come from, we dug a trench, or we dig a moat around our fortresses. And we will get to those battles later on, inshallah, right? That happened much later on. Maybe we can discuss the history of Islam, post the demise of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam and how the Khilafah of Islam spread. Anyway, back to here, where we come from in Persia, we dug a moat around our fortresses. A moat is a big trench that you fill up with water and crocodiles, and then people can't just come through, right? Alternatively, what you do is you have the big moat and you pour tar into the moat, and then you shoot arrows with fire into the tar, and then it sets the entire moat on fire. Okay, so now you definitely can't come through. What do we do? Brothers and sisters in Islam, he suggested, let's dig a trench around Medina. It was a perfect plan because Medina was situated here. There was mountains around it, date orchards on the side. There was only one part where you really needed to dig a trench, okay? And they then decided, you know what, this sounds like an awesome idea. If we can stay inside Medina this time, we dig the trench because it's going to be a huge army. For us to now leave Medina and then go and fight, we might not have the numbers. So let us rather take a defensive stance. We dig the trench, don't even let them come into Medina, but we fight them from inside Medina, barring them from coming in. And Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam then makes the decision that this is what we're going to do. The trench was huge, by the way. I can't remember how many kilometers it was. I think approximately 14 kilometers across. They had literally 2 weeks to dig it, 5 meters deep, 5 meters across. It was a massive, massive task. First and foremost, he instructs that the trenches are going to be dug. But what about the women and children? Because the men are going to be digging trenches all day. So send the women and children to the Banu Haritha tribe fortress. Send them to the fortress, let them stay there, and they'll be safe and sound inside, and they'll be guarded. The morale of the Muslim was extremely, high, because Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was in the trenches with them, digging. They were saying poems and slogans together, and du'as were happening. And then there's this miracle where Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam strikes a stone and sparks come up, and he strikes the boulder again and sparks come up, and he says, I see the palaces of Persia, I see the palaces of Rome in Muslim control. It seemed completely far-fetched, but it happened. The Sahaba, their morale was boosted so bad, but they were hungry and they were starving. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was in it with them, a perfect leader, physically participating with the Sahaba radiallahu anhum in even the difficulty that they tied stones to their stomach. The Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam tied too, right? He didn't even allow himself to enjoy comfort. Like we find leaders today, what they would do is they would sit on their high horse, enjoying the luxuries and comforts. I don't want to point out the politicians of today globally, but the plebeians on the ground are the ones bearing the brunt of everything, and all the concessions that the politicians have, they're not even experiencing any of the difficulties on the ground. So that's not the kind of leader Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was. He was a hands-on leader. And Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam made every effort to show the Sahaba that he's in it with them and boosting their morale together. Even hurt his finger, and he said this poem, Anta illa isba'un damiti wa fi sabilillahi ma laqiti, that you are just a finger that has gotten hurt, but what has happened to you has happened in the path of Allah, so we hope for the reward from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He also considered the personal needs of the Sahaba radiallahu anhum while they were digging the trenches, because some of them needed to go back to their homes and take care of their personal business. They would come and ask him for permission, and he would grant him that permission if it was necessary, but there was also conditions to it, right? So both prior to and during the siege, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was the higher authority, the sole leader, making all the final decisions. But there's a couple of pertinent points, 6 actually here, 6 points, right, of a true leader. Firstly, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam ordered the trenches to be dug, as had been discussed. So he discussed with his Sahaba radiallahu anhum. He got the advice from those who were in the know, and he advised as well in a hadith that if you're going to consult with people who know what they're talking about, consult with people who know the field. And when he decided the trenches were going to be dug, he went and decided where the trenches were going to be dug, and he pointed it out. Number 2, he distributed the work among his Sahaba radiallahu anhum, breaking them up into groups of 10, and each group was responsible for digging a certain amount of the trench. They weren't responsible for all of them going in. He structured it like project management, you know. He supervised the work being done, and nobody was allowed to leave without his permission because of the amount of time. They only had 2 weeks to get it done. Number 4 was that he assigned different groups to guard. So he not only had the groups that were digging, but he also had the security as well to guard and make sure that nobody comes in, the ladies are looked after, the children are cared for, the flocks attended to, the orchards around are also okay, right? He then also inspired the Sahaba radiallahu anhum to work hard and did things to raise their morale. Like I said, he was there with them. When he struck that boulder and the sparks came up, he told them about this miracle, this wahi that Allah had given him. He was there reciting poems with them to boost their morale. He was the stones on their stomachs, he had on his stomachs too. So on his stomach too. So he was living the situation with the Sahaba radiallahu anhum, not keeping himself aloof, making himself available. I mean, just him being there with them was such a boost for them, right? And then lastly, he kept everyone united under his leadership, right? So with the approach of an army that was like 10,000 strong, the unity among the Muslim camp was top priority. Bearing in mind, this was not just the Quraysh coming. It was what you'd call like the United Nations marching on the Muslims, right? All the United Tribes around Makkah marching on the Muslims. And you had the added threat that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam knew it was instigated by the Jews who had ties to the Jews in Medina already. So that was an added threat. So he needed to have them in the absolute highest of spirits. He was on the ground with them, making dua for them, telling them of the promises of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So in the back of your mind, but if we're going to be conquering Rome and we're going to be conquering Persia, obviously we're going to have to win the Battle of Khandaq. So you had that in the back of your mind already. Like that, he boosted them and he kept them together, had them in groups, so nobody was really overburdened. And then there were still miracles happening apart from the sparks flying and the wahi that was given. There were other miracles as well that just boosted the Sahaba radiallahu anhum even more. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless us with understanding. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us tawfiq that we can follow the life of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam in word and deed, and that we can live the life of Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam so that people see the life of Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam in our lives. Subhanallah bihamdi, subhanaka Allahumma wa bihamdika, ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.